Good afternoon, class. Checking in, I wanted to take a few minutes to put finishing touches on the comments I began today. We were talking about this storyline and our daily objective, looking at these early movements, these early challenges that help define the new set of relationships between the liberal democratic West and the communist East under the Soviet Union. And so really we're seeing the emergence of the two great superpowers of the late 20th century, the United States in the West and the Soviet Union in the East. And so I'm going to be clicking through some of the things we talked about in class. Briefly, we talked about the three the three big conferences that the Big Three had throughout the concluding years of World War II, and how really, in many ways, the emergence of the Cold War were evident in the tense issues and challenges that the United States and the Soviet Union confronted as World War II faded from the present into the past, and now the big question was, what of this new post-World War II order? And not too difficult to understand, the U.S. and Soviet Union will play a critical role in this. So once World War II was concluded by essentially fall of 1945, we know that this distrust that was evident even during World War II between Joseph Stalin and his liberal democratic allies in the West, that obviously is not going to just disappear. In 1946, Winston Churchill, in many respects, fires what comes to be known as sort of the opening salvo or opening offensive in the Cold War in a speech that he delivers. He references an Iron Curtain, and he says that an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and all those areas east, from Trieste to, what are the two cities that he calls? Essentially from the Adriatic to the Baltic seas. If you look at your map, you'll see what that means. A line has been drawn across Europe. And to the east of this line are those regions that are controlled by the Soviet Union. We could use the term Second World. And to the west are those First World regions that are controlled by the United States and the liberal democratic Western Europe. And so this speech becomes a really powerful moment symbolically. Leave it to Winston Churchill to use a powerful metaphor, and he does that, and this in many ways sort of becomes the symbolic future of the Cold War world. Now immediately things are tense, and of course it's worth bearing in mind that the world has just stepped back from its second great global conflict in the past 20, 30 years. And so, as is often the case after war, the appetite for war goes down dramatically. So it's now left to President Truman, again a fairly new and unseasoned President of the United States, to determine what to do next. And some of the early suggestions are, some of the early metaphors to guide American foreign policy in this new era post-World War II. The bad apple metaphor, and the idea, I believe this idea came from Secretary of State Dean Acheson, U.S. Secretary of State. He indicated that if there is a rotten apple left in a barrel, that it will soon contaminate the entire barrel. So the idea is that if you allow a bad apple, if you allow a country to sit as a communist place, that it will eventually rot those areas around it. And that starts as an interesting first metaphor, but of course that would mean that you would have to remove the apple and destroy the apple if you wanted to destroy the spread, in this case, of communism. And that's going to be a tough thing to sell in a world that has just been racked by a second world war in a very short period of time. But the issue does come up rather quickly in Greece at the time. In 1946, Greece, under the leadership of Joseph Tito, as he comes to be called, Tito, is engaged in a communist uprising, a communist revolution. And immediately the question becomes, what, if anything, should the United States do to counter that? Actually, I should correct it. Tito is in charge. He's a leader in Yugoslavia, which is right next to Greece. So the question becomes, as Tito sets his mind on Greece, what, if anything, should the United States do? And here we have the emergence of the Truman Doctrine, which is essentially a strategy for the early Cold War of how the United States should properly respond to the threat of communism in the world. And so Truman indicates that the United States will aggressively support with money and possibly defense assistance those parts of the world that are actively resisting the spread of communism. And so the situation in Greece becomes a really important early chapter, and the United States does dedicate funds, and there is enough interest in fighting democracy in Greece to keep it from falling to the influences of its nearby communist Yugoslavia. So that becomes a close call for the spread of communism, but the Truman Doctrine seems to work in this early expression of it. Later we'll see the Marshall Plan, and General Marshall, the United States military, will successfully put forth, really building on the Truman Doctrine, a plan to create money and support for those parts of war-torn Europe that are now perhaps considering, it could be that a communist government and economic system could be attractive to war-torn Europe. So the United States authorizes as much as $13 billion in spending to go to support those parts of Europe that are needing to rebuild. And the idea is that money and support from the U.S. becomes thought of as like an inoculation or a vaccination against communism. Of course, Stalin is quick to seize upon this, and he just says this is the equivalent of the United States just trying to buy friends and buy support, using its money rather than its influence and its ideology to succeed. And so this becomes sort of an interesting moment. Here's a map of Germany. On the next slide, I'm going to talk about some developments in Germany. And it's worth noting that Germany is going to be divided up in a really sort of interesting patchwork. You see the three liberal democratic countries in the West, the United States, France, and Britain, will have about 2/3 of Germany, and then the communist country of the Soviet Union in the East will take the East. What also complicates this is that the capital of Berlin, seen here, is smack dab in the middle of the Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany. So a very similar arrangement will happen for the city of Berlin. So Berlin is actually going to be occupied by these four countries as well, but it just happens to be surrounded by communist-controlled, Soviet-controlled East Germany. More on that in just a bit. Okay, so Europe is dividing. We know that at the end of World War II, the Soviets had moved in. Stalin has parked his soldiers, and they are controlling much of Eastern Europe. And what they're doing in this time is they're also taking a lot of the valuable industry and manufacturing infrastructure from Germany. They're breaking it down and shipping it east back to the Soviet Union, where they are rebuilding some of the manufacturing capacity that the Germans had in relatively strong and relative abundance. So by 1947, the United States foreign policy has taken on a rather clear definition, and we'll use the term containment to describe this. And what containment refers to is the United States is not interested in rolling back and removing communism where it has already established itself in the quote-unquote second world, but it is going to stop communism from expanding in the least. In some ways, this is a little bit like President Lincoln's philosophy about slavery when he takes the presidency in 1960. the idea that there will be no expansion of slavery. Here there will be no expansion of containment. So, or I'm sorry, no expansion of communism. So containment becomes the policy, and it will function for some time. Now, in this period of time in the early years, containment is going to be tested, and the Soviet Union, as I mentioned here, takes from Germany what it can, that it can try to profit from economically. So the Soviet Union is leaning on its spoils of World War II pretty heavily in the case of East Germany. But what the West does, so the countries of the United States, Great Britain, and France, they try to re-establish and merge the three different portions of West Germany that each of these countries controls. Stalin is offended by this because he sees it as a way of trying to make the Soviets look bad because they are not willing to give up and allow Eastern Germany to act under its own self-determination. So in response to this effort, what Stalin does is he circles Berlin. Remember, the city of Berlin has been divided up into 4 different occupation zones, 3 of which are from liberal democratic regimes in the West. And unfortunately, this creates some problems for these Western liberal democracies, because Stalin is now going to prevent access to those areas. And so now, as a result, the Berlin airlift will take place, and I'll refer to that a little bit tomorrow when we get together. Okay, have a good one. Thanks. Bye.